Crowds of refugees crowded the banks of the Danube. The Germanic tribes of Visigoths and Ostgoths were driven from their homes by the irresistible Hun horde. They had nowhere to go. Only to the south, under the wing of the mighty Roman eagle. The Romans could not let the fugitives into their territory. The Germans would have crossed the Danube anyway, one way or another. When they filled the Roman provinces of Thrace and Messia, it turned out that these refugees are not only unhappy and hungry, but also demanding and aggressive, and their patience ends quickly. And then already the Roman citizens had to endure hard times. In the fall of 376 on the banks of the Danube accumulated fugitives, and there were frighteningly many of them. Strangers made an impression not only by their numbers, although there were many women and children among them. The barbarians moved with their families, with carts and horses. The backbone was made up of strong, healthy warriors. Naturally, the Germans were not for Rome some kind of wild thing. Skirmishes with them occurred at the Romans long ago, and some went to the Roman service of the whole tribes, such called federates. Actually, federates are soldiers of the auxiliary Roman troops, provided to the empire by one or another barbarian tribe. Between the barbarians and the emperor concluded a treaty, according to which the Romans paid Germanic wages. By the way, it was called stipendia, and issued food. The duties of the federates included the defense of the borders of the Roman state. It should be noted that the federates always remained a separate army and did not mix with the Roman legions proper. They had their own commanders. They lived on their own territory and kept their own customs and religion. Therefore, by the time when on the banks of the Danube will gather in anticipation of crossing the huge mass of Germanic Westgoths, some of the Roman commanders on the other side of the border will already have barbarian names, such as Richomer or Merobab. The reason for such a mass exodus of the Germans was the invasion of their lands by the Huns, a tribe exceeding in its savagery every measure. The Huns first appeared in the territory of the Alans, not far from the settlement of the Ostgoths, also known as the Ostrogoths or Greftungi. Another branch of the Gothic tribe, the Visigoths, had by that time already separated and lived near the Dniester. When the Huns invaded, the Alans were partly exterminated, partly conquered. Their remnants joined the Hun horde. After that it was the turn of the neighbors. The Huns broke into the Gothic lands, and the leader of the Ostgoths, Germanerich, thought about it, as Jordan, the compiler of the history of the Gothic people, put it. For some time Germanerich not without success fought off the enemy, but the Huns did not become less, and their aggressiveness did not diminish. Meanwhile, the leader was already very old. He was almost 100 years old, and in addition suffered from an old non-healing wound. According to the legendary story, tired of the endless struggle, Germanerich took his own life, and a certain Vidomir was elected in his place. Vidomir tried to negotiate with the Huns. Probably, by that time the Ostgoths had already passed the first awe, which covered all, not only civilized Romans, but even barbarians, when meeting with this new people, shaggy, always on horseback, countless, bloodthirsty and savage. Nevertheless, Vidomir soon became convinced that the Huns, too, were people like any other. The new Gothic leader offered several Hun tribes payment and thus drew them to his side. This act led to a new balance of power. Now the Huns and Alans fought against the Ostgoths and Huns. But Vidomir lost. His troops were defeated, and he himself fell in battle. Power passed to two military chiefs known as Alate and Sifrak. Clever and cautious, they saw that the situation was hopeless for them and decided to leave, saving the remnants of the tribe. The Ostgoths moved to the Dniester and settled in the territories bordering the lands of their Westgoth brothers, ruled by the cunning old Adenarich. Adenaricus soon found out about everything that had happened and instantly realized that sooner or later the Huns would reach the Dniester and attack him. Therefore, he decided to prepare in advance and set up a large camp not far from the place where the Ostgoths stopped. To prevent the Huns from taking him by surprise, Adenarich sent out an advance party, and then quietly made preparations for the battle. For the leader of the Visigoths it was not the first battle, but the old warrior did not even suspect what he would soon encounter. Soon the Huns really appeared on the banks of the Dniester. Adenarich's advanced detachment was absolutely powerless before the nomadic horde. The Huns did not even distract him, but simply flowed around the island like water and rushed on. It was night, the moon was shining in the sky. On the bank of the river the camp was quieting down. People were settling down for the night, fires were burning out. Suddenly the darkness literally exploded. Adenarich's Visigoths were attacked, shrieking, by horsemen in masks, braided, horrible, like demons. The Goths themselves were, in general, bloodthirsty and brave men, but they could not resist the onslaught of the Huns and fled into the mountains. They were so frightened by what happened that they began to hastily build a wall from the banks of the Prut River in the direction of the Danube, in the hope that the Huns at least somehow will be delayed by this barrier. However, such a weak fortification would hardly have saved them from the invasion. Unexpectedly, the pursued were saved by something else: the abundance of Huns captured booty. The rapid movement of the horde overloaded with wagons stopped. Rumors about the invincibility of hitherto unknown kind of people were spreading. A real panic was spreading among the Gothic tribes. There was another circumstance: the lack of food, so most of the Visigoths separated from Adenarich. This part of the Visigothic tribe was led by an extremely enterprising and clever leader named Fritigern. The second leader is called Alaviv. The Visigoths under their leadership decided to move to the Roman province of Thrace. There were excellent pastures, and besides, Thrace was beyond the Danube, an insurmountable water barrier. The Visigoths sent an embassy to the Roman Emperor Valentus, asking for permission to cross and land in exchange for military service in the interests of the empire. Valentus was in Antioch at the time, busy with the war with the Persians. The request of the distressed Germans was met by him with full sympathy. In fact, Valentus was receiving combat-ready frontier troops ready to guard the frontiers of the empire along the Danube. This would allow him to reduce or even cancel the enrollment of local citizens in the army, and military service for them was replaced by a payoff. The amount of payoff varies from source to source, but, in any case, it promised good revenues to the treasury. As a result, Valentus willingly promised to give the Visigoths lands in Thrace. Here we should take into account another important point. It is not quite clear on what terms the Goths received Thracian lands. Judging by some data, at that moment, when the people of Fritigern literally fled from death and were ready for any conditions, Valentus offered them a colonate, that is, a dependent position and division in the settlement. In other words, the actual destruction of the tribe. Such an assumption is not openly stated anywhere in the sources, but it is logical, since the Goths appealed to the Roman emperor as begging for help. West Goths have defined a place of crossing. The Danube flotilla of the Romans also went there. To lead the operation came two Roman military bureaucrats, Lupitzin and Maximus. The Roman historian characterizes them in the following terms: their malignant self-interest was the cause of all the troubles. While the barbarians, transferred to our side, suffered hunger, these disgraced commanders made a shameful trade. For each dog they took one slave. It means first of all the outrageous fact that the Romans were in full swing trade in dog meat and even rotten meat, which was sold to the starving at exorbitant prices, so that the Germans were forced to give themselves or their own children into slavery, so as not to starve to death. In addition to the fact that Lupitzin and Maxim began to profit from the misfortunes of the refugees, they glorified themselves by their complete inability to organize the crossing. The people really gathered extremely large. The barbarians erupted into the empire like volcanic lava. Ships were not enough. The Germans literally stormed every boat. No turn was not observed. All climbed aboard at the same time. Several ships sank. In addition, the crossing was not only where the Roman authorities indicated. The barbarians crossed the Danube and uncontrolled, as soon as they found the opportunity. And among those who crossed were not only Visigoths. In the midst of pandemonium to the banks of the Danube came Ostgoths led by Aleti and Sifrak, with some Alans and Huns. They also asked for lands in the Roman Empire. The Ostgoths were refused. No matter how great the empire was, it could not accept such a large number of barbarians at the same time, or at least was afraid to. Far-sighted leaders of the Ostgoths did not argue and simply camped far from the crossing, waiting for a convenient moment. In the meantime, the Visigoths were somehow brought to the Roman bank of the Danube. The crowd of barbarians moved on, to the places of their supposed settlement. Lupicinus sent some of his troops to accompany them, and the crossing was left unguarded. It was then that the men of Alethius and Sifrak came again to the shore of the Danube. They did not need a flotilla. They built rafts and themselves, without Roman help and Roman permission, entered the empire. Meanwhile, the Visigoths under the supervision of Lupicin reached the city of Marcianople, modern Devnya in Bulgaria. There was the headquarters of the Roman troops stationed in Thrace. Every day the situation of the settlers was getting worse. Supplies ran out, food delivery was not organized, and in the settlements of the crowd of barbarians, for obvious reasons, was not allowed, so they had nowhere to buy food. Moreover, no one wanted to see a horde of hungry, desperate, angry people in the city, so the gates of Marcianopolis closed. The Visigoths crowded under the walls of the city. Probably, the inhabitants of Marcianopolis looked at the sea of people with horror and were even afraid to imagine what would happen if the strangers flooded the streets. Lupicin meanwhile decided to placate the Visigothic leaders and did it traditionally, invited them to a feast. Thus, while hungry barbarians wandered under the walls of the city, their leaders with a small retinue sat at a rich table with the Roman commander and negotiated. The noise at the gate was increasing. There were already scuffles. The barbarians insistently rushed inside with a shout that they only want to buy bread at the local market. Lupicin found nothing better than to take the Visigothic leaders as hostages, and for a start ordered to kill the retinue of Fritigern and Alaviv. The sensitive hearing of the barbarian leaders caught the shouts. Fritigern was the first to realize what was happening. He took out his sword, rushed to the exit, made his way to the gate and shouted to the Roman guards that he intended to calm his men. The Romans let Fritigern out. Alaviv's name is mentioned in historical sources for the last time in connection with this bloody feast, so we can assume that Alaviv died. The rioting mob now had a leader. The Westgoths did not ask the Romans for anything more, and they were not going to buy bread now either, but scattered over the area and began to plunder the population. The barbarians were soon joined by local antisocial elements, runaway slaves, workers dissatisfied with their masters. The riots threatened to become massive. Lupicin hastily gathered forces and moved against the barbarians. He had no plan. He was just trying to stop Fritigern. In the end, the massacre that happened near Marcianopolis was terrible for the Romans. In the bloody fierce battle fell most of the soldiers, banners were lost, officers fell, except for the unfortunate commander, who thought, while others fought, only about how he could escape. After that, the enemy dressed in Roman armor and began to roam everywhere, meeting no resistance. The Marcianopolis debacle was indeed shameful. In those days the Romans thought it couldn't get any worse, but they were wrong. The worst was yet to come.